transportation planner or engineer. He's simply somebody who looks at the world around him with a layman's eye and comments on it and really takes a deep dive. And as somebody who likes to geek out on things, I appreciate some of his blog posts, things that he's done, both on his own blog, The Deleted Scenes, as well as various blogs that we all read, like Greater Washington and others. And so he takes a fascinating look at things, looking at culture, design, history, the built environment. Particularly, I love the interest in retail and taking a look at the history of supermarkets and why certain retail establishments are thriving and others aren't. So some really fascinating stuff. And so he writes a daily newsletter. Hope you'll choose to follow that, and really appreciate him lending his wisdom. We won't hold him against him that he lives in Reston, across the river, but certainly want to thank you, Addison, for joining us. And I guess with that, I'll leave things to you.
Thank you. You can all hear me, right? Of course you can. Well, thank you for the introduction. That's all great. There's only one thing. I'm not at the American Conservative anymore.
Oh,
I'm
so sorry.
I'm a super full-time freelance writer. I am going it all on my own right now. Actually, they laid me off because I don't think I told their right-wing politics enough for their liking, which doesn't bother me.
Well, hope that the background is helpful, that you come at it from not quite as left-wing view as many.
Yeah, well, he said it well. I write a newsletter every day, which in the writing industry parlance is kind of a blog, which I trust you all know what a blog is. We call it newsletters now, but same basic idea. And I write for a bunch of different magazines as a freelancer, and basically I just do this full time. And as I said, I came out of the magazine world, and that was how I got interested in this. But it's a funny story, so I'll tell you how I got interested. I started at this magazine, conservative political magazine, 5 or 6 years ago. And that's about the last place you would probably think I'd be getting interested in urbanism and housing and land use. Certainly not from a favorable perspective. But they actually had this really interesting grant program that they called New Urbanism, which they sort of meant generically. It wasn't associated with the Congress for New Urbanism, but broadly, same idea. And I didn't know what any of that, meant when I started there. But I wrote an article about an old motel near my hometown. And I kind of wrote about historic preservation and should we preserve commercial structures that aren't valuable per se, but that are interesting or that have become landmarks. There's an old dry cleaner somewhere here in Silver Spring that you're having that argument about right now, from the 50s, I think it must be.
I think it's right in my neighborhood where they're going to tear down a building on East West Highway.
Yeah, is that where it is? It's got a.
It's kind of like it may not be the most magnificent example of this, but I think it's an Art Deco building, and it's the only one in the neighborhood.
Yeah, so exactly that kind of thing. And I wrote this article with no real background in any of this, just kind of weighing, do you keep it and do you have this continuity in the landscape and it's a landmark and people remember it? Or do you let the landscape evolve as consumer preferences change and things change? And I kind of said you have to let things change, but we can also value the past. And that was what I wrote. I was just writing it for fun. I liked this old motel. It had a neat sign. And my editor said, can I run this for New Urbs, which is what they called it, shorthand. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay, what's New Urbs? Fine. And he ran it there, and I started looking at their archives for that section. And I wrote another piece about old buildings, and he wanted to run it again. And that's how I got interested in this stuff. I realized that I was interested in it after I read a lot of it. And I ended up running that program for them until they let me go for reasons not related to how I ran the program. So I didn't come at this from a sort of activist viewpoint or trained professional viewpoint or really anything. It was just something I had a casual interest in, and over the years I've learned a lot more about it, and eventually it just became my main area of interest. And so now I write this daily newsletter that's about all this stuff, basically. So I'll talk a little bit about two of the topics that I come back to in particular. I mean, there's a lot. There's so much that at this point you could show me a piece I wrote a year ago and I might not remember it. But
Speak a little louder.
a little louder?
Thank you. Yes.
All right, we can go. I don't know if that's working. We can go a little louder. So two of the topics that I come back to frequently are, I'll start with the first one, which is the suburbs. So you might think with the stuff that I write about that I'm not so keen on the suburbs, but I actually think the suburbs are really cool, and I write a lot about them. And, sometimes you'll hear stuff like, this was something that I was told. A woman was writing an article about the suburbs, and she wanted to interview me, and she interviewed another urbanist, and he apparently told her, I don't know why there's any strip malls left in the United States at this point. And I kind of said, well, any strip malls. I mean, 90% of the country is strip malls. I mean, it's there, and you've got to kind of work with it. And you have to work with what you have and make it better. And if you look at Silver Spring, I haven't written about it a lot, but we're here. If you look at Rockville, which I've written about quite a bit, or Annandale in Fairfax County and other places in Fairfax County, or even Reston, where we have a downtown that's probably taller than Washington, D.C. These are really interesting places. They're diverse places. They aren't white middle-class bedroom communities anymore, where not having anything was almost an amenity. You did your work and you did your shopping somewhere else, and you just kind of went home and slept there. Maybe you had a neighborhood shopping center. But slowly these places are evolving into something much more interesting than that, and that accommodates a lot more different people and different lifestyles and different preferences. Annandale in Fairfax County, which you may or may not be familiar with, started basically a bedroom community. 300 years ago, probably was a small town. Today, it's a huge epicenter of the Korean community in our region. Rockville is basically the Chinatown of Washington, D.C. A lot of people went there in the 60s and 70s. They left after the riots. They left, they were pushed out. However they ended up there, they went to the suburbs, and now if you want great Chinese food, you go to the suburbs. There are Chinese newspapers there, radio stations. Not just stores and restaurants, entire communities that live in the suburbs, and that wasn't really the way it was when they were built, and it was just sort of tract houses and all that stuff. So a lot of people who are critical of suburbia don't really realize that this has all transpired in the last 20 or 30 years. So while I definitely consider myself an urbanist and a housing advocate, and I think these places do have to change, I think the dry cleaners probably should become housing. Maybe you keep the sign so that we can remember a piece of what used to be there. But change and growth have to happen in a region like this. But we would make a really grave mistake if we looked at what our region has evolved into now, and we said, that's just junk. That's just a strip mall. That should be torn down, and we should start new. That's what we did with urban renewal. And, to make that same mistake now after almost a century of suburban growth would be a real mistake. And there's one example I'll give you. Two examples, actually. One from this county and one from Virginia. How many of you have ever heard of Eden Center in Falls Church? A couple.
That's all the Vietnamese?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, cool. That's a strip mall built in the 60s, super typical shopping center. And by the 1980s, it was 20 years old. It was a little bit distressed. Probably would have been torn down for, a mixed-use development if it had gone the way it was going. But it ended up becoming a central point for the Vietnamese community, which was pushed out of Arlington into Fairfax County. And so this distressed strip plaza ended up hosting all of these Vietnamese businesses and restaurants. And to this day, it's a fixture of that community. And it's also a tourist attraction, really one of the few tourist attractions out in the suburbs, half an hour from the city. And people will travel there, drive there, It's not that easy to take transit there, unfortunately. But people will go from far away to see this strip mall. But you don't get there and you say, oh, this is a strip mall. You say, wow, this is a place where a community comes and shops and eats and socializes. And the land use leaves a lot to be desired, and the surroundings and the transportation leave a lot to be desired. Maybe one day the parking lot can become housing. Maybe one day the highway can be narrowed down. However that happens, that can happen and that should happen. But you're not looking at a strip mall anymore. You're looking at so much more, and that's only the case because we've allowed that, frankly, bad land use to evolve into something over all this time, and for people to add to it and to make it their own. And the other example, some of you may have seen this article of mine, you might have, about the food trucks outside the thrift store on Veers Mill Road. There's a shopping center there with an old discount store that's now a unique thrift store. And
Is that the one that used to be a movie theater?
it might have been. I'm not sure what it used to be. I'm not sure.
I haven't been there in so long. I'm trying to. Is Randolph Road the cross street?
It might be.
Yeah, it's Randolph and Veers Mill.
Veers Mill. Is
Yeah,
that the
so
one?
It used to be a movie theater, and I don't know what else was there because I
Huh.
graduated high school in '69.
Oh, that very long time ago.
Yeah, it's Korean Corner and
Unique
and then
Thrift.
CVS. Or actually, I think CVS closed.
Yeah, that's the one. I actually wrote an article about that shopping center. One of the things I noticed was it's a little bit more of a working class community, I think, than it was when it was all built. And a lot of people don't own 2 cars anymore, or even own 1 car. They walk there from the nearby neighborhoods. And what that means is that the big parking lot for these stores is underutilized. I think the code probably still says you have to have this many spots for every amount of square footage, but it's not needed anymore. And there are food trucks that sit there in that parking lot and serve people for lunch. People come and eat. I was told on Twitter by one of maybe it was you, one of the ACT folks, that there's a guy who does church services in the parking lot, and a guy who sells fruit and vegetables, and someone does auto repair out of that parking lot. And that's not the best setting for all of those businesses. They shouldn't have to operate out of a derelict parking lot. But they're taking this bad land use and they're making something out of it. And I think there has to be a way to recognize that instead of sort of writing it off because we don't like the land use. So there's something in there for everyone not to like, maybe. But that's one of the big themes I write about, is sort of taking an urbanist approach to the suburbs, I guess you could say. And people find that interesting. It's not a viewpoint that you might hear often from either people who don't like the city or people who don't like the suburbs. So it's interesting. And the other big theme that I come back to is sort of the nature of urban settlements. I'll just give you an example because that's not very clear. I was in New Jersey, where I'm from. I grew up in New Jersey, and then I moved to Maryland and then to Virginia. So those are the 3 states that pop up in all my writing because I know something about them. But I was back home in New Jersey. I'm from a little town called Flemington. We have about 4,000 or 5,000 people. We have a little 2-block, multi-story main street, classic American town. But I was taking a picture of a neat old building a few miles from Flemington in another town town called Three Bridges. And Three Bridges is three buildings at an intersection. That's the town. It's called Main Street. There's a couple of businesses, and that's about it. So I had never really even been there before. I didn't know what it looked like. So I said, gee, this isn't really a town. But I did a little thinking, and I kind of crystallized something that I had been chewing on in my work. That, Flemington probably looked like that when it was new. Three Bridges isn't not a town. It's an embryonic town, which is really to say an embryonic city. And Flemington is a small city that never got bigger, and probably even New York City started with three buildings at an intersection. And the point that I drew out of that is, people will often sort of swallow the idea of small towns into the suburbs. So the way we talk about this stuff is kind of the big city and everything else. And so the suburbanites and the ex-urbanites sort of claim the town for themselves. But I like to flip that on its head, and I like to sort of say, a town is a small city. A city is a big town. They're just at different points in their maturity, or they grew to a certain point because of what the economic situation was or where they were located. For whatever reason, Flemington became the central town and not Three Bridges. But there's probably an alternate universe where Three Bridges grew and Flemington is three buildings on a street. And so the line that I actually wrote this one up just a couple of weeks ago, was, let me see if I can get it right. The big land use divide isn't between the suburbs, or between the city and everything else. It's between urban settlements of any size and the suburbs. So when I talk about what I would like to do to the suburbs, it's not that I would like to turn them into Manhattan or into the big city. It's that I'd like to relearn how to build what we call a town, because that's urban too. You can go to the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, or you can go out west here in Maryland, and you will find these really dense, compact little towns with multi-story buildings and mixed-use downtowns and single-family houses out on the edge, all on a grid, all walkable. And then you can drive 5 minutes and you're in farmland again. And that's cool. That's what we did when we were free to build. Nobody designed that. That was the pattern that arose. And it's, to a great extent, it's zoning that forces us to build in a way that none of us really seem to like all that much. And once you start to think of it like that there are urban settlements and there's this sort of newfangled suburban development pattern, it all starts to look different. And I grew up in a Republican family. I never cared about this stuff very much. We grew up in the suburbs. And I would have just sort of taken on the attitude that you learn in the suburbs. That, the city, you don't want to live in the city, you have to go there to work, then you come back to your nice house, and, we want to keep it the way it is. But as I started to think about this stuff and learn about it, I started to see it differently. And that viewpoint that I would have absorbed by osmosis, it no longer feels natural to me. It feels natural to me instead to say, let people do things, let people build things. That's how we built the places in this country that we still love. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't do that again. And all right, there. I'll stop there and I'll let you pepper me if you'd like to.
So that area around Unique Thrift Store, which is awesome, by the way, and great food trucks, but how legal is that, the presence of those food trucks there?
Well, I don't know. He asked me the sort of informal commerce in the parking lot, in the thrift store parking lot. How legal is that? I don't know. I would venture to guess some of those businesses are unlicensed. The food trucks might be licensed. I don't know that they're permitted to operate there, or what that permit looks like. Is it, something that you'd need to renew. Maybe you haven't renewed it. I don't know that. I don't know how to find that out. I wouldn't want to say, I wouldn't want to get anyone in trouble, but I can probably say with some certainty that if the zoning board wanted to look at it real close, they could find a problem with it. But the fact that you can have that discussion is kind of the problem, that one of the first things you have to wonder is, oh, are they allowed to do that? And not, oh, that's great. That's people doing the best thing that can be done with this space. That, with the zoning codes and the parking requirements, we arrest that natural process of people doing business and socializing and making use of our space.
I guess I was. Oh, I'm sorry. Someone else had a question.
He can continue. We'll get to you next.
I mean, it seemed like your argument to me was that this very cool, wonderful place is formed because we have this big open space where there used to be a lot of cars and there's less cars now. So there's space for these food trucks and these mechanics. How possible would it be that formed without that big open space?
I don't know that it would have. What I would say, instead of asking that, I would say now that the open space is there, because the parking lot probably was needed when it was built. Everybody in that neighborhood did own one or two cars. I think over the years the space has been used differently. And so my argument isn't it should have been open space from the beginning. I mean, I wasn't there in 1960 when they built it. I don't know why they built it that way. But now that the actual use has changed, the problem is the code doesn't allow you to recognize that. So instead of saying, okay, the parking lot can go now, or here, you're free to use it, it doesn't need to, you can turn it into grass, you can turn it into a real open space. Instead, we sort of criminalize people actually evolving, allowing the place to evolve to what it is. There's a tension between what the place is on the ground and what the code says it's supposed to be. I guess that was my point. Why it was built the way it was, I'm not sure.
wanted to ask you about the modifier of mature suburbs, which I think I first came across in reading about the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Is that something that you talk about, kind of the organic growth of small towns? Do you write about that?
Sort of. I'm not familiar exactly with what you're saying there, but one interesting thing, and I guess that's kind of the idea, is you can look at a lot of early suburbs, and today they almost look like what you'd call a town. They have that urban feeling, partly because of the way they were built, and partly because they've kind of grown into themselves. And so I guess I look at what we're building now, and I kind of hope that it can grow into itself in the same way.
I'm curious, take that example of the center with unique thrift. I mean, we look at, as an organization like ACT, we'll often look at something like that and think, well, this is a place where people, often don't have multiple vehicles for a household, so we need to provide more transit options. So obviously we're talking about the Beers Mill bus rapid transit line down the road. Randolph Road is on that map too, makes it a much more transit accessible place. Of course, the flip side of that is that sometimes, that can drive development. You could see a shopping center like that turning into, a mixed-use complex that doesn't have a big parking lot. I guess, how do you address that tension of sort of what's lost to natural market forces there, how that affects affordability? I mean, how do you look at those challenges?
Well,
I know that's a $64,000 question.
Yeah. Well, the other thing in addition to transit is doing something about the highways that surround these properties now. that were also built with the expectation of everybody driving. I know it's one of the most dangerous intersections in the area. But to your question, that's not something I get into all that much, because it's a real, that is the question, but it's also, there are so many questions on the outside where people don't go that I try to go. Generally, I mean, my background is conservative. I generally trust the market. I'm not a market fundamentalist. I'm not a maximalist on, deregulate stuff. I've been following a little bit with the purple line, and I know you're having this argument everywhere with the purple line as well. These are places that are affordable, but they're also affordable in some ways because they're the oldest places in the region. I mean, Langley Park, which is one of your purple line stops, I don't believe there's been a new apartment building built since the mid-century. So that's not the kind of affordability that we would want ideally. And so I would favor, requiring affordable units in new housing. I don't think you should let profit run roughshod over everything. I would also want to know why it is that Eden Center isn't getting redeveloped. That's because it's actually worth so much that it's worth a lot is what it is. And it would be nice if we could find some way for the market to reflect that value. But in that case, it actually does. I don't know if it would in the thrift store with the old parking lot and the possibly unlicensed food trucks. And if it doesn't, I can't give you a strict answer, but I wouldn't say let the market do whatever it wants. I would come down somewhere in the middle.
I will try not to make a speech. I'm going to be 71 in about a week, and I have already pretty much lost optimism about the future, and really fear that the best we can hope for is that for our overall situation not to rapidly get worse because of entrenched patterns, land use, population, all, capitalism, all of it. And, if people ask me, I mean, it's interesting to hear about Eden Center and all these, funky little things and the way these old spaces, I guess was the word, are being used, and that's really interesting. But one of the things I'm very concerned about is loss, and that may even be a very personal, almost psychological thing. And I fear that things like mass extinctions and death of coral reefs and drowning in coastal cities and utter disappearance of rare ecological niches is almost inevitable. And the only conclusion I can come to from that is, yes, diametrically opposed to the market system, is that market capitalism as we know it is not sustainable. And I don't know where to go with that. I don't know how to deal with it incrementally. We went so far, so fast in the wrong direction under he who we do not name. And then, of course, there's Putin and Bolsonaro and all the rest of them. And to take it locally, I am 10,000% opposed to Larry Hogan's plans for road widenings and new road building. I think we have to get off automobile dependency. The problem with that is automobile dependency and sprawl are like entrenched patterns. How do we even moderate it? How do we stop it? And what I hear is, well, you build more stuff around metro stations. Okay, and apparently that's controversial. I mean, all of these things, as far as I can tell, are interconnected, very difficult to solve. And, I would like to see a switch from privately owned vehicles to mass transit. I would like suburban sprawl to come to a screeching halt. I think there is too much conspicuous consumption and waste by certain parties. I do not think people should be allowed to build homes and businesses in environmentally sensitive areas like the tops of mountains, near or on earthquake fault lines and in floodplains. But I got into an argument on Facebook. You can't tell people where to live. You know, we have the right to live near an earthquake fault line. I mean, I just, I feel almost utterly hopeless. And I essentially came to this meeting just to see how other people were feeling. And I was very intrigued by your description of yourself as an urbanist. I'm not quite sure what that is. But, my main thing is I'm a music journalist. I've never written, I'm not trained in this area, if that's what you'd call it. I rant and rave on Facebook. I don't know what that accomplishes. So I'm kind of just, rambling here, open question to you and everybody else in the audience. And yes, I recognize you. Anyway.
Well, I thought he asked me a hard question. Well, to all of that, there actually is something I'll say that at least addresses some of it. I like to say to people, your locality's zoning code is probably more important to your daily life than the occupant of the White House. And I don't mean that politics is not important, but that a lot of this stuff is hyper-local, and, maybe it shouldn't be. California pulled it back to the state level. I think that's an interesting experiment with zoning. But this stuff happens at the hyper-local level. I don't know how many of you know of strong towns or read them. They're one of these organizations in this space, broadly speaking. I write for them. And they take this incremental approach. And what I've sort of done, I sort of take that too. And in my language, I talk about devolving the scale at which we do things. So what you're talking about is sort of massive change from the top, maybe. Which, maybe. But the way I think about this stuff in terms of what anyone can actually do is lower the scale at which we do things. It's really interesting. This is another thread that I've been pulling on lately. How big box retail and car dependent land use kind of go together. In my hometown, we've probably got 20 little small towns, all around the county, rural, ex-urban county. 100 years ago, these towns had train stations, they had hotels, they had little grocery stores. Every little town was its own community and its own economy. And you had entire regional economies that don't exist anymore. You ever notice how the hotel on the freeway has 2 or 3 names in its name? Because those places don't have their little hotel anymore. And a lot of what I write about is imagining and hoping that we could get back to a level like that, where business is done locally, where you have these webs of regional commerce and social webs, that everything isn't centralized. But centralization is built into how we build our country. It's kind of profound. But, so I'll actually make a point kind of to something that you said about if we let people build, are we going to price people out? Are we going to, is it a handout to big developers? That kind of line of thinking. And personally, I don't really think it is. I think the big developers can already do whatever they want. They're the ones who can afford the land use attorneys and can afford the delays and the paperwork and wrangling with the zoning board. It's the guy on Main Street who wants to open a pizza shop in an old gas station or in an old dry cleaners or in an old anything. Or the guy who... Yeah, and the bank won't lend it to you because they don't know what kind of project it is, and the town doesn't permit it because the code that they adopted after everything was built says that's not a conforming lot, Or the guy who wants to turn his house into a duplex. And people say, well, no one would want to do that. Well, look at the places where it's been permitted. In Minneapolis, in California, statewide, in other places. and suddenly people by the thousands are doing it because that demand is there for hyper-local, small-scale development and commerce, and we're just artificially hobbling it, and we're giving all of that right now to the big guys. I think we need to make room for the small guys.
So I'm just curious, that argument, that line of argument you just made, I've been surprised that that doesn't seem to resonate with a lot of conservative audiences out there. And I'm curious, working for a conservative publication, did you find inroads, or did that make intuitive sense, or did you just, what was the reaction to that, let's let people build what they want to build argument?
The reaction is mixed. A lot of people like that idea. A lot of them in particular kind of stop and think when I give my talk about how small towns are really cities, and that we're really talking about two different patterns rather than sort of making it a culture war about the big city. That's the kind of thing that makes people look a little bit differently. But yeah, you also get people, curiously to me, who think that zoning is itself a kind of property right. That, like, my property right is that no one can build an apartment building next to me, which isn't a property right. But that viewpoint is really entrenched. And also, of course, some very nasty stuff. I had a guy comment on one of my articles, would you like an incinerator or a coal-burning power plant or an affordable apartment building next to your house? Well, one of those things isn't like the others, I hope. So I ran into a lot of that, but I was also surprised at how many people did think differently when they heard it presented differently, because a lot of conservatives have only ever heard, the left wants to turn everything into New York City, and look at what the Democrat-run cities look like, and smart growth is communism or whatever. The progressive war on cars. You've probably heard all that stuff. That's the extent to which a lot of people have ever heard anything about any of this, and that's dismaying. But that's also kind of the reason I do what I do. I consider those people a potential audience, and some of them are. Some of them have become.
It's kind of a bridge between, for lack of a better way of putting this, people like myself and people who would nominally be called conservatives.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, my politics are, across the board. Small C conservative, I like to call myself. I'm not a Republican, but the approach I take to this is friendly to the market, but as I emphasize, it's also friendly to small-scale commerce, to making room for ordinary people to do things. And that's really not political at all. I mean, philosophically, you could code that as conservative, but it's just kind of the way things were done. On the one hand, I try to sort of say I come at this as a conservative, but I also try to pull it away from politics, which maybe is a little bit contradictory, but it works.
Well, actually, I was curious, something from your resume, a lot of things that you were just saying were things that sound like they kind of echo Center for a New American Dream, and I saw that was in your history.
You were for them?
I interned with those guys in college, yeah.
That's quite a background you've got.
I also
what was that experience? Do you feel like they're making any headway? I feel like in some ways maybe it's a little bit, Sisyphean task that they've taken on. And I'm just curious what that experience was like and how that plays into anything.
Yeah, I also interned with the World Watch Institute, which I told one of my conservative Catholic readers about that, and he said, "Oh my God, those guys are so left-wing. Why would you have anything to do with them?" But I think it's a great thing that my audience is so across the board. But yeah, the Center for a New American Dream, I think they changed their name now. But what they do, what those guys write about, I interned there for a summer, several years ago. But they're kind of against consumption and buying less and making do with less. And, when you talk to conservatives about that, what they often hear is, we want to take away your nice stuff. We want to deprive you. But I saw it more from a philosophical point of view as, maybe all the stuff doesn't make us happy. Maybe we can be content with things that matter more. I mean, I'm a Catholic, and I think of it almost from a spiritual point of view that, Jesus warns that rich people have trouble getting into heaven. And it's funny how that part gets dropped out of the Bible a lot of the time. But, I mean, it's in there. It's in there.
I'm certainly not wealthy, but my lifelines is music magazines from the UK, and I am very aware of how they get here.
And in fact, this is a little off topic, but one thing I remember when we had these shutdowns for the pandemic back in early 2020, and conservatives were sort of saying, we have to get the schools open, we have to get the stores open, we have to get everything open again. And, you can have your public health debate. I thought they were wrong. I thought we had to do something. But more philosophically, I thought, this is a chance to sort of test out maybe we can do more with less. Maybe we spend more time with our families and we buy less stuff. And yet it just sort of, when they had to choose between those commitments and the commitment to the economy, they chose the economy. And as a conservative, I would have broken in the other direction. I don't know if that answered what you said. I said, as a conservative, I would have gone the other way. I would have been okay with putting a pause on the economy and seeing, how things went.
Maybe another question. I'm curious. So you're on your blog, you list some of your favorite pieces that you've ever written. I'm curious if there's anything you'd like to share along those lines, something you found particularly fascinating and relevant to tonight's conversation, maybe something Montgomery County focused.
Well, the one I gave you about the parking lot was Montgomery County. I have a piece coming out in Greater Washington next month or late this month about the agricultural reserve, which I haven't written about previously, but it's fascinating. And so I'll just say a little bit of what I'm writing since it is coming out. In Fairfax County, where I am, if we want to go, apple picking or something, or go to a winery, you have to drive almost an hour, 2 or 3 counties away, way out past the exurbs into the countryside. If you live in Montgomery County along I-270, you can drive 15 minutes to get to all of that stuff, because you guys have the agricultural reserve, which I had heard of it. I never really knew what that was. A friend of mine who lives in Clarksburg gave me a tour of it. She's in this brand new development right along the highway. And within 5 minutes, we're on this little country road, and there's an orchard, and there's a farm, and there's a guy in a tractor in the street. And there are these little kind of sleepy-looking old towns, just like the little towns in New Jersey. And just the fact that you can have that so close to everything else, it's fascinating. That's, I guess, an example where planning did something good. That, the natural outcome might have been to sprawl over all of that, and you guys didn't do it. The other half is building more where you've already built stuff, and we have to do better on that half. But that's really fascinating, because Fairfax County used to be dairy farms 50, 60 years ago. Our entire county has lost that agricultural character, and Montgomery County hasn't. So that's really interesting. And since sure.
Go ahead, continue.
No, go ahead.
What perked my interest in your writing stuff like that was the article that you wrote about Beltway Plaza Mall.
Oh, of course. Well, that's Prince George's County, but that's another one I did. The Beltway Plaza Mall.
Because I shop there all the time.
I
Right near my house.
I used to shop there all the time. That's very cool. That was another mall built in the 60s. And it was kind of at one point distressed. And one of these properties, there is a proposal to redevelop it, but it's been very slow, and it may or may not happen at this point. But they're actually building housing on one of the back parking lots, which is now underutilized, which is a good start.
Is there a metro station there?
Not that close. It's up in Greenbelt. Yeah, the connectivity is not great. Yeah, that's about it.
There's a development right there that says Greenbelt Station. You can't get to the Greenbelt Station from Greenbelt Station.
That's right.
But that area right there where the bridge is on 193, right there, University Boulevard, that would be the perfect location for an infill metro station because it would be halfway between College Park and Greenbelt.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting landscape, and that's a really interesting mall. It's still there. It's now full of independent businesses, and a lot of them are immigrant-owned. Almost all of them are not chains, and it's great. I mean, it's still in pretty good shape. 90% of the stores are occupied, which is better than a lot of shopping centers. So that was I was going to mention that, and I ended up with the other two. But it's another example of an old retail property that has grown into something more than you would expect from looking at it, and that,
There are 3,000 apartments behind it, too. What used to be Spring Hill Lake.
Yeah,
I know it's
I
got
forget what
another
it's
name
called
now.
now, but one of the problems I know they have there is it's those things are there's a lot of fires in there because the wiring and stuff like that on them was not really built up to code when they were built. But also there's been a lot of the crime in the area comes out of that area, and that's one of the reasons why they're thinking about redeveloping, chasing the crime out. Greenbelt, Beachy County.
well, anyway,
Is the shopping mall as a center of crime activity?
No, it comes out of the apartments behind there.
Oh.
But I know there have been problems in the mall where there's been assaults and stuff like that have taken place in there, and a lot of it is pretty good. The residents back there in the apartment complex. That's why they're talking about redeveloping the whole thing, because in their mind that would take care of the crime problem, is just chase it out. Put $1 million condos back here and you don't have to worry about it.
well, chasing something out doesn't make it go away.
Doesn't make it go away, just goes from point A to
That's just
point B.
cosmetics. That's not.
Right, but that's,
You don't get to the root of anything.
right.
So,
Everything's cosmetic now.
Did you
one more question?
want to see us out?
Okay, well then I'll hold on. Somebody else does one. I know basketball myself. All right, well, I was just curious, following up on the agricultural reserve question. Maybe that goes to the question of sort of how conservatives view this sort of thing. I mean, that's one where it was sort of preserved through regulation as opposed to, I think maybe the more conservative alternative would be to do conservation easements, which of course are still subsidized through the tax deductions, but then are sort of held by a private entity, a non-governmental entity. I'm just curious, do you think that one way is better than another? How Maryland did it with more, government involvement versus how it's done in some other places to maintain agricultural areas?
I don't think the mechanism is terribly important. I think the real key thing about it was that it's a single contiguous piece of land. Because where I'm from in New Jersey, we have tons and tons of open space, and it's very much a NIMBY thing, and it's sort of just like, we don't want to build stuff here, so we'll call it open space. And you have this patchwork where you might have a farm here or a field here, and then a strip mall and a subdivision and another field, and it's not a functioning countryside. It's not really what it is anymore. By keeping an entire chunk of the county under conservation, it still functions as agricultural land, which is where I think the value in it is, because people who live in the city can get to that type of stuff really easily, and that's cool. There isn't that long penumbra of sprawl in between those fundamental land uses. How they got there, I don't think matters as much as the result.
So if the farmers want to put solar panels on their farms, a free market person should say that's fine, right?
I suppose so. I don't know if that's an issue there. But yeah, I wouldn't see why not.
I mean, what would the mechanisms be to make sure that some space is left undeveloped? Yeah, I understand the ag reserve here really isn't an undeveloped space. It's not a national park. It's not a wilderness. It is a managed space. God, that's the right kind of expression.
And it's owned by the federal government.
Not Montgomery
I
County.
don't think.
No, PG, we're talking about over in,
Oh, you're talking about the
The ag
USDA
reserve, yeah.
research facility.
behind, behind Greenbelt up in that area, all that open space.
Okay.
That's all owned by the federal government.
That's a bit different, but
Well, I will tell you what my most read ever article is at my newsletter. It's actually about a Pizza Hut in Prince George's County. I also do a series on old buildings and kind of what did they used to be. Because going back to that first thing I ever wrote about the motel, I kind of have this interest in old buildings. And I did a ton of research into figuring out how this Pizza Hut started life, because it didn't used to be a Pizza Hut. It was something else. And I went through this whole historical inquiry to track down what it was, and it used to be this local chain that very few people even remembered, and it was a neat story. And that thing got read more than anything else, so you really never know.
Have you investigated how the center of Rockville evolved from what it was to what it became? Because that's like a really notorious thing.
Oh, yeah.
Where they, tore down the old, like almost a New England type Main Street.
Yes.
And replaced it with a mall that went poof, and it was a complete white elephant.
They urban renewaled the entire town, and they built an office park, and then they built a fake town on top of it. So yeah, that's do not emulate. What a shame.
Well, I want to thank you, Addison, for coming and speaking.
Thank
with
you.
us. We really appreciate it.